Part 38. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 371. After finishing the work, it was already evening. Damantha returned to her room tiredly. Opened the door to the room. Seeing such a scene in front of her, Damantha's eyebrows lit up slightly. She could see ahead, a man in a bathrobe lying on her bed, looking at the ceiling. Seeing this man, Damantha's eyes were filled with excitement. She smiled, entered the room, and closed the door. She said, "The sanctuary has not been liberated yet. You came to my room so blatantly. If you are discovered, the laws of the sanctuary will not let you go." Chen Tao turned to look at Damantha and said with a smile, "Have you forgotten? I am from outside the territory." "Yes, I haven't forgotten," Damantha said. "Not only are you from outside the territory, you are also a person from outside the universe." As she spoke, she showed her usual hearty smile and said, "Okay, no more talking. I've had a busy day, so I'll take a shower first." Timanza went into the bathroom on her own. Looking at Damantha's back, Chen Tao withdrew his gaze and looked at the ceiling. Pei had been with him all day. Now Pei was exhausted and she was sleeping soundly. Of course, Chen Tao didn't want to disturb Pei. It happened that Chen Tao also wanted to know the status of Damantha's investigation, so naturally Chen Tao came over. Waiting for a girl to take a shower can be a bit boring. Chen Tao closed his eyes and waited for the time to pass. Probably half an hour later, Chen Tao heard the sound of the bathroom door opening. There were footsteps approaching slowly. Chen Tao felt the bed beside him move slightly, and then someone came over. Chen Tao could smell a faint aroma. Chen Tao opened his eyes and looked at Damantha beside him. Damantha had just finished taking a shower. She was wearing a thin white lace gauze skirt. She was lying next to Chen Tao, leaning into Chen Tao's arms. Chen Tao smiled, raised his hand, and stroked Damantha's hair. Damantha leaned her little head on Chen Tao's shoulder and closed her eyes. Chen Tao could smell the faint fragrance on her body. Damantha closed her eyes. "Today I led a team to investigate 3 major areas. In the past, those 3 major areas were full of thunder beasts, but after a day of investigation today, there were no monsters in those 3 major areas. See? This was unimaginable before. I can be sure that you didn't lie to me. It's just," Damantha said with her eyes closed, "it's just that the commander doesn't seem to be at ease." "I plan to continue the investigation tomorrow," Timanza said. Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. He smiled and said, "Well, let's continue the investigation." He didn't think much about it. Since Leslie, as the commander of the sanctuary, felt dissatisfied with the investigation results and did not trust Chen Tao, then just keep investigating. He leaned closer to Damantha, smelled her fragrance, and looked at her beautiful face. Eyes facing each other. Chen Tao came closer. Damantha's eyes trembled slightly and she allowed Chen Tao to kiss her. The next day, just like before, Damantha once again gathered the people from the resource group, once again left the sanctuary, and conducted a large-scale investigation outside. At night they returned to the sanctuary, back to the sanctuary. Damantha met Leslie once again as commander. Leslie sat in a condescending seat, looked at Timanza, and said, "How is the situation?" Timanza looked at Leslie and said, "I took 50 people from the resource group out to investigate today, and divided the 50 people into a team of 2 people. At present, all 50 people have returned, and without exception they have obtained as a result, we didn't encounter any monsters." Timanza looked at Leslie seriously and said, "Commander, I can confirm that Chen Tao did not deceive us. All the monsters in the outside world have been eliminated." Leslie looked at Timanza's firm expression, and his old face hesitated for a moment. He looked at Timanza and said, "Timanza, if humans can live outside the sanctuary, Then what do you think of our sanctuary? Do you still need to stay according to the rules? Hearing this, Dimancha was slightly startled. She looked at Leslie in confusion and said, shouldn't this promise be obvious? The main reason why we established the sanctuary law is because of the shortage of resources. We have to use the laws of the sanctuary to constrain people and optimize their genes. If human beings can go outside the sanctuary, then there will be no problem of resource shortage. Dimantha looked at Leslie and said, in this case, then naturally the laws of the sanctuary cannot be kept. Leslie frowned, why is it impossible to stay? This is the knowledge of the new world. Dimancha was startled, Commander. Leslie said lightly, after leaving the sanctuary, the laws of the sanctuary are no longer suitable? Then you are too ignorant. The laws of the sanctuary are the laws of the new world. If there is no such law to maintain it, even if you are outside the sanctuary in this world, without the guidance of the laws of the sanctuary, it is difficult for humans to avoid extinction. Looking at Dimancha's pale expression, Leslie's eyebrows slightly stretched, and he said, I know Dimancha, you are very resistant to the laws of the sanctuary. In fact, this law is not unchangeable. Dimancha looked at Leslie seriously. Leslie put one hand behind his back, turned his back to Dimancha, looked at the scenery outside, and said, it just takes time to change the rules. It takes time? How long? Dimancha looked at Leslie's back. Leslie said, let's talk about it when the time is right. It's not right now. You continue to watch the changes outside the sanctuary for a while. Before that, keep this matter secret and don't let the residents in the sanctuary know. Dimshaw was slightly startled. What does it mean? Now, Dimancha understood that the commander in front of her was greedy for power and status, liked this kind of dictatorial feeling, and didn't want to liberate the sanctuary. Realizing this, Dimancha wanted to say something, but looking at Leslie's back, Dimancha didn't know what to say. She could only remain silent and leave. 20 minutes later. In the bedroom. Chen Tao came out of the bathroom in a bathrobe, and he glanced at Pei Ai on the bed. Pei Ai was sleeping lazily, with her eyes closed, her face full of fatigue. She had fallen asleep. Chen Tao didn't disturb Pei Ai either. He retracted his sight, sat on the sofa by himself, poured himself a glass of red wine, and then opened a picture and watched it by himself. Knock knock. There was a knock at the door. Hearing the sound, Chen Tao looked at the door. Chen Tao, it's me. Dimancha's voice came from outside the door. Hearing this voice, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, he stood up and walked to the door. Open the door. As soon as he opened it, Chen Tao saw the beautiful woman standing at the door. It was Dimancha. Dimancha was wearing a black leather bodysuit, outlining her perfect and mature figure. Her legs were slender and straight, and matched with a pair of high-heeled boots, which made her perfect figure even taller. Her upper body was propped up high, supporting an impressive amplitude. Dimancha was wearing a windbreaker, and she looked like a leader. Dimancha was looking at Chen Tao with a serious face and said, is it convenient to talk? Seeing Dimancha's serious expression, Chen Tao smiled and said, come in. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 372. Dimancha entered the house and looked at Pei Ai, who was lying on the bed, sleeping soundly. She said, it seems that you are not so gentle towards Pei Ai. Chen Tao closed the door and looked at Dimancha when he heard Dimancha's voice. Dimancha was sitting on the sofa as she spoke. With a playful smile on her face, she looked at Pei Ai who was lying on the bed, and then looked at Chen Tao. Seeing that Dimancha had returned to her previous demeanor, Chen Tao smiled, I am already very gentle, but too many times of gentleness caused Pei Ai to consume too much physical energy. After saying that, Chen Tao also sat down and looked at Dimancha in front of him. Dimancha was wearing that tight leather bodysuit that fit her mature figure and was really beautiful. He looked at Dimanche and said with a smile, "How about it? Do you want to help pay AI and bear such tenderness together?" Dimanche blushed slightly and said, "Let's talk about that later. Let's talk about business first." Dimanche's smile faded, and her expression became more dignified and serious. Chen Tao looked at Dimanche and said, "What happened?" Dimanche looked at Chen Tao. "I conducted an investigation together today, and it is almost completely certain that there is no threat of monsters from the outside world. However, Leslie does not seem to intend to tell the people about this matter. He does not seem to intend to the law of the sanctuary. As much as I hate to admit it, I've smelled it too." Dimanche looked at Chen Tao seriously. "The commander still wants to continue the current dictatorial system? He doesn't seem to want to give up his power." Seeing Dimanche's serious look, Chen Tao looked at Dimanche and said, "Then, what are you going to do?" Dimanche looked at Chen Tao and said, "I want to change the holy domain, but I don't have this ability, so I want to use your ability to change the entire holy domain. I want everyone in the entire holy domain to know that there is no one outside the holy domain. Monster, there is no such thing as a virus." Chen Tao looked at Dimanche and said with a smile, "If you want me to help, you have to pay a price." Dimanche was startled for a moment, her face flushed slightly. "I was mentally prepared when I talked to you. As long as this matter is resolved, I will do whatever you want me to do." Chen Tao looked at Dimanche's serious expression. Chen Tao stood up slowly and said, "In that case, let's do it this way." Dimanche looked at Chen Tao. She also stood up and looked at Chen Tao. "How to do it?" Chen Tao smiled and said, "That's it." The words fell. Chen Tao and Dimanche disappeared from the spot, and when they reappeared, they were suspended in mid-air. Dimanche was slightly startled, and she subconsciously looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao spread out a pair of pure white wings behind him, and the wings exuded a white luster in the night sky. He was flapping his wings and controlling his body to fly in the air. Dimanche was slightly startled. Chen Tao has wings, but the problem is, what about her? Chen Tao can use his wings to keep himself from falling, but Dimanche can't. But the problem is that Dimanche doesn't feel like falling. She seemed to realize something and subconsciously looked back behind her. When she looked at it, her eyes trembled slightly. She could see a pair of pure white wings growing on her back. The wings were flapping slowly, supporting Dimanche from falling. Wing. Dimanche looked at Chen Tao subconsciously. Chen Tao smiled and looked down. Dimanche looked down along Chen Tao's line of sight, and she saw the sanctuary below. She was shocked to find that she and Chen Tao were directly above the sanctuary, right at the center of the sanctuary, directly above the central headquarters of the sanctuary. This height is very high, and the entire sanctuary, including the superior and inferior areas, can be seen. Dimanche didn't understand. What was Chen Tao doing? At this moment, Dimanche noticed someone below looking here. There are several guards in light mechas below, looking above. "Look, up there." One of them spoke up. The companion next to him also looked up and noticed the scene above. Those are Chen Tao, the outsider, and Dimanche, the leader of the law enforcement team, right? What's behind them? Wings. Is it some kind of high technology? High tech? But their wings don't look like technology, they look more like wings made of flesh and blood. The wings behind Chen Tao and Dimanche were glowing with white light, and this light attracted the attention of many people. However, at this moment, Chen Tao and Dimanche also emitted white light. The light was so bright that it looked like Chen Tao and Dimanche were half wrapped in two balls of light. It is night, but in this moment, Chen Tao and Dimanche were like two white sunbeams, lighting up the sky for half the day. The light emitted enveloped the entire sanctuary. Let the sanctuary be as bright as day. This light is too bright. Many people walked out of the room one after another, looking at the sky above and looking at the two holy balls of light in the sky. What's that? It's such a bright light, but not dazzling. What are those two balls of light? Are they something that replaces the moon? No, it doesn't seem to be a ball of light. You can see people inside. It's a human being. People? How is it possible? They are in mid-air. How can people stay in such a place? Wait, that is really a person. At first, the man's eyes were not used to it, but halfway through, his eyes got used to it, and he saw Chen Tao and Dimanche in the light ball from the white light. Are those wings? There are two people inside, both with wings. Wings. Then, is that a god? Is it a god? This light, which can illuminate the entire Holy Land, and there are wings, isn't that a god? Oh my god, it's really a god. The white light gradually faded, so that everyone could vaguely see the two people in mid-air. But because of the distance and the influence of light, the people underground couldn't see the true appearance of the two people. A faint voice sounded. Your world is too chaotic. I am the king of dragons and the god of the universe. In order to save the civilization you are in, I personally come down to earth. The voice was not loud, but it reached the ears of everyone in the Holy Land. Hearing this voice. Oh my god. It's really a god. A panicked voice sounded. It can be seen that some people on those streets suddenly knelt down and worshipped in the direction of Chen Tao. As some people knelt down, people gathered on other streets also knelt down one by one. God, looking at the scene in the sky, Leslie frowned tightly. Jenna stood aside, looking at the two people in the sky, through the high-tech vision of the helmet. She could clearly see Chen Tao and Dimanche inside. Chen Tao, what exactly does he want to do? Jenna was puzzled. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 373. Jenna is a rational person, she doesn't believe in any ghost events. In Jenna's opinion, Chen Tao and Dimanche obviously used some unknown high technology to achieve this level. Jenna has seen the technological power displayed by Chen Tao, and she has reason to believe that this is what Chen Tao did. But Jenna doesn't understand, what are Chen Tao and Dimanche planning to do? Chen Tao looked at the people below, and he continued, this god has used this god's power to clear the filth of your world. Viruses and monsters generated by viruses, from now on, you don't need to stay in this holy land. The faint voice was not loud, but slowly floated into everyone's ears, the sound was so clear. Hearing this voice, everyone in the Holy Land was shocked. One by one, they showed an expression of disbelief. Including Jenna. Jenna's expression was full of shock. Cleared. Leslie's face changed slightly, and he looked at Jenna and said, Jenna, take your team immediately and shoot down the guy who pretends to be a ghost in the sky. Jenna was stunned, and she couldn't help but look at Leslie. Jenna has always been a cold executioner, but now Jenna hesitated for the first time. No matter what Jenna does, it is for the Holy Land, and the orders issued by Leslie have always been for the Holy Land. But now Leslie's order made Jenna doubt. If what Chen Tao said in the sky is true, then he is a great hero of all mankind, but Leslie gave such an order to this hero. Why? Jenna, Leslie looked at Jenna and said, quick. Are you going to disobey the order? Jenna retracted her sight, looked at Chen Tao and Dimanche in the sky, and said nothing. Seeing this, Leslie was stunned. Jenna? You. Thank the God of the universe, suddenly a voice sounded. Hearing this voice, Leslie was startled and looked around. Thank God of the universe. After hearing Chen Tao's speech, the entire sanctuary was briefly silent, but after the silence ended, there were sporadic sounds. At first, there were sporadic sounds, and then the sound became louder and louder. Thank God of the universe! Thank God of the universe! The voices of the entire sanctuary were connected, and the sound was deafening. Leslie was stunned, and he suddenly noticed that the guards next to him put down their weapons one by one and knelt down in the direction of Chen Tao. Seeing this, Leslie was stunned. What are you doing? He was furious and said, everyone listen to my orders, pick up your weapons, and attack the people above. Hurry up. But no one paid attention to Leslie. Leslie was stunned, he gritted his teeth, took a gun from the guard next to him, and pointed the gun in the direction of Chen Tao. Pull the trigger. Bang. A bullet shot in the direction of Chen Tao. Clang. The bullet lit up a burst of fire in the air and disappeared. This bullet could not get close to Chen Tao at all. Chen Tao narrowed his eyes and looked in the direction of Leslie. The four eyes met. Leslie's old face turned pale. Seeing this, Chen Tao narrowed his eyebrows slightly and said lightly, Leslie, the commander of the Holy Land, for his own rights, he knew that there was no danger outside the Holy Land, but he still chose to hide this matter. Now he dares to disrespect this god, looking for death. Hearing this voice, Leslie's pupils condensed slightly. Chen Tao opened his hand and clenched his hand towards Leslie. Leslie's pupils shrank. Bang. Leslie's voice turned into a blood mist and dissipated. After dealing with this, Chen Tao retracted his sight and said, people are equal, and should not be divided into different levels because of genes. The gap between superior and inferior areas should not exist. I will erase the gap between superior and inferior areas. The voice fell. A stunning scene appeared. The wall that was originally used to separate the superior and inferior areas suddenly glowed with white light. The entire wall glowed with white light, and suddenly the light slowly dissipated. As the white light dissipated, the wall also slowly dissipated. In the blink of an eye, the wall disappeared. Seeing this, everyone was shocked. Miracle, this is a miracle. God, it's really God. God is coming to save us. God is coming to save us. Some people repeated the sentence, and some even burst into tears while saying this. Looking at the scene in front of him, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. Frankly speaking, Chen Tao doesn't like to play tricks, but now Chen Tao can only choose to do so. Only by pretending to be a god can he liberate the sanctuary and save the civilization. The figures of Chen Tao and Dimansha disappeared on the spot. The light also disappeared instantly. Although Chen Tao and Dimansha left, Chen Tao's actions tonight are destined to turn the sanctuary into a sleepless night. Jenna looked at the place where Chen Tao and Dimansha disappeared. She slowly retracted her gaze and looked at the place where Leslie died just now. Her eyes were shining. Tonight is destined to be a turbulent night. At the same time, Chen Tao and Dimansha returned to Chen Tao's residence. Dimansha looked behind her and found that the wings behind her disappeared. She looked at Chen Tao. The four eyes met. Chen Tao smiled. Dimansha's eyes were shining with a strange light, and she said, I didn't expect you to have such a method. Chen Tao smiled and said, I can't help it. I didn't want to do this, but now it seems that I have to do this. Is what you just said true? Suddenly, a voice came. Chen Tao was slightly startled. He looked at the source of the sound, which came from the direction of the balcony. Pai, who was wrapped in a thin shirt, was standing on the balcony, staring at Chen Tao. It seems that the movement just now also woke Pai, who was sleeping soundly. Pai came back from the balcony, which means that she had obviously seen everything just now. Chen Tao said, what? Chen Tao just did several things, and he didn't know which one Pai was talking about. Chen Tao first announced the removal of monsters and viruses, then the killing of Leslie, and then the destruction of the wall. He didn't know which one Pai was talking about. Pai looked at Chen Tao and said, you said you cleared all the monsters and viruses, Is that true? For Pei, this is what she cares about most. Although Leslie is the commander, she has little contact with Leslie and is very unfamiliar with him. Pei doesn't care whether he lives or dies. She doesn't care about the wall. What she cares about most are monsters and viruses. Those are the things that threaten all mankind and what she cares about most. Chen Tao nodded slightly. Seeing Chen Tao nod, Pei's ink-like eyes lit up. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 374. Although Chen Tao promised Pei that he would liberate the sanctuary, in Pei's view, that was a very distant thing. Incredibly far away. Pei was born in the sanctuary and grew up in the sanctuary. Pei has lived for so long, and what he is taught every day is for the holy domain. The sanctuary is a huge machine, and humans are just the cogs that keep the sanctuary running. Pei had seen despair before, and once the food in the sanctuary ran out. Because the food ran out, a horrific and desperate thing happened in the inferior area, with corpses all over the ground. It later subsided, but the horrific image remained etched in her mind. As a soldier of the resource group, she has experienced countless narrow escapes in order to collect resources outside, and has also seen countless deaths of fellow soldiers. She would never forget those horrific images. Pei has always wanted to change, to get rid of those monsters and break out of the wall. But this idea is like a fairy tale. Pei felt that this was impossible. But now, the man in front of him told Pei that the monsters and viruses had been eliminated, and humans could break out of the wall and resume their previous lives. Pei looked at Chen Tao with trembling eyes, and she suddenly started running. Chen Tao felt a fragrant breeze coming towards him, and then his soft body came closer and entered Chen Tao's arms. Chen Tao was slightly startled. He looked at Pei in his arms. His eyebrows stretched slightly, his hand raised, he slowly hugged her and gently stroked her hair. Pei raised her face and looked at Chen Tao. Her eyes were filled with tears. She said, I thought this day would never come. Chen Tao looked at the tears in the corners of Pei's eyes. Look at these silent tears. Chen Tao raised his hand and slowly wiped away her tears. His eyes fell on her thin lips and he lowered his face. Kissed. Parted lips. Chen Tao looked at Pei and their eyes met. Seeing the moisture in Pei's eyes, Chen Tao smiled and said, I promised you, of course I will do it. Do you think I'm joking? Pei's eyes were glowing, and with a smile on her face, she slowly rested her little head on Chen Tao's chest. It's great to have you, Pei said softly. Chen Tao blinked and smiled. Ahem, suddenly, a cough sounded next to him. Hearing the cough, Pei was slightly startled, her face turned red, and she hurriedly got out of Chen Tao's arms. Pei saw dementia, her cheeks under the corners of her eyes were slightly red, and said, Captain. Timanza showed her usual hearty smile, crossed her arms across her chest, and said, we haven't seen each other for just a few days, and you have become even more feminine. Pei was slightly startled. She looked down at the messy shirt on her body. She blushed, held the collar of the shirt with her hand, turned sideways, and untwisted the unbuttoned button. More feminine? Chen Tao looked at Pei in front of him. From this angle, he could see Pei turning sideways, perfectly taking in her curves. Pei's upper body was wrapped in a white shirt, her waist was full, and her upper body held up the shirt slightly. Although it was not that shocking, it was beautiful. Looking down, the hem of the shirt is very short, and you can see the slender thighs, which are long, straight, white, and delicate. Her long, ink-like hair naturally hung behind Pei, ending abruptly at her waist. Pei's side face is delicate, and she looks beautiful. Indeed, compared to the past few days, Pei has a mature temperament unique to a mature woman, which is a different kind of charm. And this is obviously attributed to Chen Tao. Chen Tao looked at the charming little face in front of him and smiled. So, what are your plans next? Suddenly, a voice came from beside him. Hearing this voice, Chen Tao looked at Dimancha beside him. Dimancha looked at Chen Tao with a serious expression and said, "You have now shown your face in front of the people in the sanctuary. Now that the commander is dead, what you do and what you say will matter to the people in the sanctuary, become the word of God, and you will have supreme majesty, and people in the sanctuary will listen to you. So, what are you going to do?" Dimancha looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao looked at Dimancha, smiled and said, "I plan to do nothing." Dimancha was slightly startled. "Do nothing?" Chen Tao said, "I'm an outsider, so I don't intend to get involved in your affairs. And, in this holy domain, the commander is gone, but you are still there." He looked at Dimantha and smiled. Dimancha's eyes glowed. "You mean, you want us to come?" Chen Tao nodded slightly. "Yes, you are the leader of the resource group. You have always brought food and other things back. I believe that both superior and inferior citizens are full of gratitude to you. You speak, they will all listen. And it's Jenna. I went to Jenna before, and Jenna doesn't seem to be that stupid person. You join forces with her. I think the sanctuary can be reorganized." He looked at Dimancha and smiled. Dimancha's eyes glowed. "Jenna," she frowned slightly. She continued, "I remember that Jenna obeyed the commander's orders very much, and she has always strictly abided by the laws of the sanctuary. Now I want her to agree to change the laws of the sanctuary. Can this be done?" She looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao smiled, "Of course." As he spoke, Chen Tao walked to Pei Ai and held her horizontally in his arms. Pei Ai was slightly startled. She looked at Chen Tao, with doubts in her big eyes, but her cheeks were a little red. Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai's blushing face, and he smiled and said, "There's nothing to do late at night, let's do something fun." Pei Ai's face became even redder, and she buried her little face in Chen Tao's arms, not daring to look up, but her ears exposed outside were red. When Dimancha saw this, her cheeks also turned red, and she said, "I won't bother you anymore, I'll go back first." Dimancha was about to leave, but when she grasped the door handle and turned it, she found that the door was locked and couldn't be opened at all. Dimancha's face was as red as a rosy cloud. She knew that this must have been said by Chen Tao again. Knowing that Chen Tao had no intention of letting her go, she didn't say anything, and could only stand there, leaning against the wall, looking at Chen Tao and Pei Ai. Even someone as bold as Dimancha had a red cheek. What Chen Tao did tonight ignited the Holy Land. In the past, the Holy Land was dead at night, and most people stayed in their rooms. But tonight the Holy Land became unusually lively. The monsters were gone, the Holy Land was about to be liberated, and people no longer needed to stay within the walls. Everyone was excited. Cheerful voices could be heard everywhere in the Holy Land. God has descended, and the Holy Land has been liberated. The Holy Land has been liberated. We can live outside the Holy Land in the future. Excited shouts enveloped the entire Holy Land. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 375. 3 hours later. Chen Tao stood by the French window in a bathrobe. Through the French window, he looked at the brightly lit sanctuary below and the people coming and going on the street with happy faces. Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, he turned slightly and looked at the bed. The two women on the bed closed their eyes. They had fallen asleep, and a trace of fatigue could be seen on their faces. Seeing this, Chen Tao retracted his sight and his figure disappeared on the spot. On the other side. In Jenna's room. Jenna had just finished taking a bath and was wearing a thin lace nightgown. She had just finished taking a bath, but she did not fall asleep directly. Instead, she stood on the balcony and looked at the scenery below. On the streets of the sanctuary below, many people were walking, and the streets were brightly lit. It was very lively, comparable to a festival. Jenna folded her hands in front of her chest and looked at the scene indifferently. It was very lively. To be honest, what happened tonight also made Jenna feel excited. The problem that has troubled the whole human race for half a century has been solved. The monster is dead, and humans can leave the sanctuary and survive outside. With the liberation of humans, there is no need to worry about many problems. Jenna also wanted to shout excitedly like them. But Jenna couldn't do it. As a serious law enforcer, Jenna has been accustomed to a cold face. Are you happy? I am very happy too, but you can share your happiness with the people around you, but I don't have anyone to share with. Jenna's eyes were shining, and she said, if I had chosen a profession other than law enforcer, maybe it wouldn't be like this now. Most people in the sanctuary are in awe of Jenna. Jenna is always high and mighty, and this has led to Jenna having no friends. Around Jenna, the most common relationships are the relationship between prisoners and law enforcers and the relationship between superiors and subordinates. No friends. She is high and mighty, which has led to no friends. Wanting to share joy, that is impossible. When Jenna was lost in her own thoughts, a figure appeared behind Jenna unnoticed. That person was Chen Tao. Chen Tao looked at Jenna in front of him. Jenna had a proud figure and fair skin. With the thin lace nightgown, her fair and delicate skin was set off even whiter. Looking at Jenna's tall and mature figure, Chen Tao slowly approached, passed his hand over Jenna's slender waist, and hugged her. In an instant, Jenna's body stiffened slightly. She subconsciously turned her face to the side and looked at Chen Tao. When she met Chen Tao's line of sight, Jenna's body slowly relaxed a little, retracted her line of sight, looked forward, and let Chen Tao hold her. Chen Tao smelled her unique fragrance. He leaned close to her ear and said gently, "What are you thinking about?" Jenna's eyes were shining, and she said, "Nothing. Very cold. Just like her temper all the time." Jenna said, "Is that what you announced before true?" Hearing this, Chen Tao looked at Jenna and said with a smile, "The investigation team of Damansa has investigated many regions and found no monsters. So, are you still not sure?" Jenna was slightly startled. She turned her head and looked at Chen Tao. "Is it true? Why don't I know?" Hearing this, Chen Tao blinked. After thinking about it, Chen Tao understood, and said, "Leslie doesn't seem to intend to let others know about this." Jenna retracted her gaze. Chen Tao looked at Jenna's beautiful face and said, "Do you remember your promise?" Jenna's eyes flashed with a hint of abnormality, and her long eyelashes moved. It was rare to see her cheeks flushed. "Of course I remember. The rules of the Holy Land will be gone starting tonight, and the rules after that have not been released yet. I think it doesn't matter if I get intimate with you." Jenna looked ahead and said, "Do whatever you want." Chen Tao smiled, and he stretched out his hand and hugged Jenna horizontally in his arms. He strode to the bed with Jenna, and he looked at Jenna. Jenna lowered her head slightly, and under her long eyelashes, her blue eyes flashed with a hint of water. Her always cold face also had a blush. Looking at this scene, Chen Tao's heart warmed slightly. The shy look of this hot iceberg beauty really made people's blood boil. Chen Tao put Jenna on the bed. Chen Tao's face was very close to Jenna's face. Jenna's eyes were watery, and she looked straight into Chen Tao's eyes. She swallowed her saliva, her expression showing a hint of nervousness. "So, what do you want to do?" Chen Tao looked into Jenna's eyes, and he smiled. "You still don't know until now." The big hand raised, lifted her hair, and fell on her cheek. Jenna's eyes were full of water. Jenna thought to herself, "This hand is so big, so rough." Jenna has never been touched on the face by a man. Jenna's eyes were full of water, and she was at a loss. Chen Tao's eyes fell on her thin lips, and he slowly lowered his face. Jenna closed her eyes. Time passed by minute by minute. Midnight. 2 hours had passed since Chen Tao came to Jenna's room. Chen Tao looked out the window. It was already past 2 in the morning, but it was still bright outside the window. With Chen Tao's hearing, he could easily hear the noisy and cheerful sounds outside. It seemed that those people really planned to celebrate all night. Chen Tao took back time and looked at Jenna in his arms. Chen Tao smiled. The aloof Jenna was like a kitten, nestled in Chen Tao's arms. Her starry eyes were half closed, her hair was messy, and there was a light blush on her face. Her expression was confused, and she seemed to be still intoxicated and had not regained consciousness. Chen Tao turned slightly sideways, looked at her, and said with a smile, "It's so cute." Jenna's eyes were filled with moisture, and she slowly closed her eyes. "You are so skilled." Upon hearing this, Chen Tao was slightly startled, and he touched the back of his head, feeling a little embarrassed. Jenna said softly, "What are you going to do after that?" Chen Tao looked at Jenna and said, "I plan to let you and Dimonsa continue to manage this world, but the laws of the sanctuary need to be modified. I hope they can be more humane, and the Gene Exchange Center, I hope it can be removed." Jenna's eyes glowed with a hint of luster. She raised her face and said, "The law of the sanctuary, how do you want to change it?" Chen Tao smiled, "I don't know about that. It depends on you." Jenna's eyes glowed with a hint of luster. "Modifying the rules is not what I'm good at. What I'm good at is enforcing the rules." "Enforce the law." Chen Tao looked at Jenna. Frankly speaking, Chen Tao still felt that Jenna was too cruel and too impersonal in enforcing the rules. But this is also Jenna's character, cold-blooded and selfless. Chen Tao touched Jenna's cheek. He looked at Jenna and said, "Let Timensa modify this law. What do you think?" Jenna's eyes were filled with luster. She raised her little hand, held Chen Tao's hand, and rubbed her face against Chen Tao's palm. She looked at Chen Tao dreamingly. "I don't know if this is right or wrong, but I said, I will listen to you. I will do whatever you want me to do." You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 376. Chen Tao looked at Jenna. He approached Jenna, kissed Jenna's forehead, and said, "Just do what you did before." Jenna hummed and slowly hid her face in Chen Tao's arms. Then, "Don't you think I'm too ruthless in enforcing the law?" she said softly. Hearing this, Chen Tao said, "Why do you think so?" Jenna said, "I enforced the law before, and you stopped me." She was obviously talking about the scene in the institute. Chen Tao said, "There's nothing you can do about it. After all, your sanctuary laws were like that at that time. If you didn't enforce the law like that at that time, then the sanctuary laws would be useless." "Well," Jenna said, "actually, I did feel that I was too cold, but I couldn't help it at the time. If I didn't do that, then the laws of the sanctuary would have no authority, and the sanctuary would fall into chaos. I can't help it." Hearing this, Chen Tao slowly approached Jenna and said, "Enforcement must be ruthless. It was not your fault at that time, but the fault of the law." "Not anymore." Jenna's eyelashes trembled slightly. She raised her beautiful face and looked at Chen Tao with her big eyes. She slowly raised her face and got closer to Chen Tao's face. They kissed and slowly separated. Jenna looked at Chen Tao with blurred eyes. Chen Tao said with a smile, "It seems that we still have time. Let's do something we like to do during this time." Jenna's face turned red and she slowly hid her body in Chen Tao's arms. "Farewell, I think tomorrow will be a very busy day," she declined in a low voice. Chen Tao's heart moved. Yes. Once Leslie dies, chaos will inevitably arise in the sanctuary. Maintaining order is the duty of Jenna, the law enforcement team, and I believe she will be very busy tomorrow. Chen Tao closed his eyes and said, then I will accompany you and sleep together. Well. Jenna closed her eyes. It didn't take long, probably less than 10 minutes. Chen Tao could feel Jenna's breathing slowly calming down in his arms. So fast. Chen Tao smiled and stroked her hair. It seemed that she was exhausted today. However, it was normal. Even if nothing could be done, it would be strange if she wasn't tired by 3 o'clock in the morning. After all, Jenna is just an ordinary person, not like Chen Tao. If necessary, Chen Tao can never sleep. As a sixth-generation genetic body, he will be fine even if he doesn't eat, drink or sleep. Now Chen Tao eating, drinking and sleeping is just a habit. Seeing that Zhen Na was so tired that she fell asleep, Chen Tao didn't bother him. He carefully got out of bed, got dressed, and left. Early the next morning, Jenna woke up from her sleep. She opened her eyes. As soon as she opened her eyes, she first looked beside her. When consciousness returned, she remembered clearly that at night, the man was lying here. But now Chen Tao is missing. Dream, Jenna asked herself subconsciously. She stood up slowly and moved her body. Jenna frowned subconsciously. There was a glint in her eyes. It doesn't look like a dream. Jenna slowly got out of bed, entered the bathroom, and took a shower. Jenna closed her eyes, thinking about Chen Tao's face. There were 2 blushes on Jenna's face, and she didn't know if it was because the water was hotter. That man was her first man, and she promised him that she would be his from now on. But thinking of this, Jenna found that what she felt in her heart was not anger, but sweetness. Jenna didn't want to think about it anymore. She left the bathroom, put on her clothes and went out. At the same time, early in the morning, Damantha had gone home to prepare for work. Pai had just finished taking a bath and came out wrapped in a bath towel. As soon as he came out, Pai saw Chen Tao still lying on the bed, sleeping soundly. Looking at Chen Tao, Pai's eyes glowed with a hint of luster, and a smile appeared on her face. She slowly approached, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at Chen Tao who was lying on the bed. Pai looked at Chen Tao. You are so special. Pai raised his small hand and touched Chen Tao's face. Her eyes glowed with a hint of luster, and she said, sometimes, you are very gentle, and it feels wonderful to be held by you. But sometimes, you are like a hungry wolf, very bad and very bad. Bad. Now, sleeping, he looks like a little boy. It's so special. The more Pai looked at it, the more she liked it. She lay on the bed and looked at Chen Tao's face with her big eyes. She blushed and said, I just don't know why, but I like you no matter what time you are, even if you are like a hungry wolf. If you just care about yourself and bully others, I won't be angry. Instead, I will be very happy. It's weird. Pai slowly leaned his little head on Chen Tao's chest. Her eyes were blurry. In the past 2 days, Pai found that he didn't understand himself. She also found that the man beside her seemed to understand her better. It seemed like everything about her was controlled by him. The more he thought about Pai, the redder his face turned. He closed his eyes and dared not think about anything. So, you also liked me when I turned into a hungry wolf, a voice sounded. Pai was slightly startled. She raised her face and looked at Chen Tao. Eyes facing each other. Chen Tao looked at Pai with a smile on his face. Pai was stunned, her face immediately turned red, and she was so shy that she hid her face in Chen Tao's arms. Chen Tao looked at Pai's shy reaction. Chen Tao approached Pai and smelled her hair. He smiled and said, have you just washed your hair? It smells so good. Pai blushed and hummed softly, just washed. Chen Tao said, today, there are no other tasks for the resource group. I think we can spend this day like yesterday. Pei Ai blushed like a rosy cloud. It was a whole day yesterday. She whispered in resistance. Looking at Pei Ai's blushing face, Chen Tao smiled. He approached Pei Ai's ear and whispered gently, "It's only one day. Do you think it's enough?" Pei Ai closed her eyes, blushed, and didn't speak. Chen Tao smelled Pei Ai's unique body fragrance, which was mixed with hair fragrance and smelled good. When he was planning to cultivate a good relationship with Pei Ai, a voice sounded in Chen Tao's head. "Big bad guy, are you going to give Xiaolu a live broadcast?" The voice came from the Gene channel. This familiar lowly voice made Chen Tao startled. "This is Betty. Live broadcast? What does it mean?" Chen Tao said, "Betty, what's wrong?" He smiled. Betty seemed angry, and said angrily, "What's wrong? You went to that world to hook up with other girls, and now you plan to do a live broadcast for Xiaolu. You still ask me what's wrong, humph. Flirtatious carrot, I have a child, and you go out to mess around with other girls, humph." Betty seemed really angry. Listening to Betty's unique lowly voice with anger, Chen Tao smiled. It can be heard that Betty is jealous again. Chen Tao said, "Miss me," his voice was much gentler. "Who misses you? Nonsense, you'd better never come back, huh? I'm ignoring you, do whatever you want." Betty's voice disappeared. Sure enough, she missed Chen Tao. This girl is very arrogant. But, live broadcast? Could it be that Li Xiaolu has been staring at Chen Tao with that mirror during this period? Chen Tao couldn't help but blink. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 377. Seeing the change in Chen Tao's expression, Pei Ai blinked and said, "What's wrong?" Because Chen Tao was talking to Betty on the Gene channel, in Pei Ai's view, Chen Tao didn't speak at all. This made Pei Ai confused. Chen Tao suddenly stopped and was in a daze. What happened? Chen Tao came back to his senses. He looked at Pei Ai, smiled and said, "I have something that needs to be dealt with." Hearing this, Pei Ai's eyes glowed. What's going on? Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai and said, "It's about your sisters." Sisters? Pei Ai became even more confused. Pei Ai looked at Chen Tao and said, "I have been alone since I was born. I have no parents and no brothers and sisters." "Who are my sisters you mentioned?" Chen Tao looked at the confusion in Pei Ai's eyes and said with a smile, "You didn't have it after that, but you did after you followed me." Pei Ai seemed to have thought of something, her eyes lit up slightly, and she said, "They are your sisters? I am your woman, so they are also my sisters, right? This explanation is just right." Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai's lustrous eyes. Chen Tao smiled and said, "No, I am just like you. I have no brothers or sisters. When I was very young, my parents were gone and I was the only one people." Pei Ai looked at Chen Tao and said, "Then who are the sisters you are talking about?" Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai, smiled and said, "They are all my women just like you. Since you are all my women, you are naturally sisters." Pei Ai was slightly startled, her eyes glowing, and she said, "When I agreed to be with you, I thought about this." She adjusted her mood and smiled, "So how many sisters do I have?" Chen Tao blinked, thought for a moment, and said, "I'll count." As he spoke, Chen Tao was really counting. Seeing this, Pei Ai was slightly startled, his smile slowly faded, and his cheeks bulged. "Humph!" Pei Ai suddenly snorted. Chen Tao was startled. He looked at Pei Ai. Pei Ai turned her face away from Chen Tao. She had unhappiness written all over her face. Looking at this, Chen Tao smiled. Chen Tao thought that people in the sanctuary would not be jealous, but now it seems that he was wrong. Seeing Pei Ai's angry look, Chen Tao leaned down and kissed her face. Pai closed her eyes and blushed on her cheeks. "You're a bastard," Pai complained softly, but she could only complain bitterly. Inside Base 1. Li Xiaolu was wearing a thin nightgown and lying on the bed. There was a mirror floating directly above her. What could be seen in the mirror was the scene of Chen Tao and Pai together. Li Xiaolu's face turned slightly red. She has no habit of peeping on others. The reason why she peeped on Chen Tao was because that world was the world she liked to observe recently. It was only Chen Tao who ran into that world without permission that led to the existence of Chen Tao in Li Xiaolu's mirror screen. Li Xiaolu wanted to know what would happen to that world after that, so she kept observing it with a mirror. But with Chen Tao joining, Li Xiaolu discovered that that civilization was being led by Chen Tao. The appearance of Chen Tao directly changed the civilization of that world. Slowly, Li Xiaolu subconsciously pointed the camera at Chen Tao. But while Chen Tao was changing the world, he also found two sisters for Li Xiaolu, and sometimes even staged live broadcasts directly for Li Xiaolu. Li Xiaolu refused at first, but then she was attracted because she couldn't resist it. Not long ago, Li Xiaolu had tasted the forbidden fruit, and she knew the taste by eating the marrow. Now that she saw Chen Tao and Pai being intimate, of course she would not be able to resist watching. Li Xiaolu blushed even more. She turned off the mirror, closed her eyes, and lay on her side hiding in bed. But Li Xiaolu felt that her heartbeat was still accelerating. Chen Tao's face appeared in her mind, and she closed her eyes. "Chen Tao." Li Xiaolu's face turned red. "I miss you so much." Li Xiaolu pulled the panda doll next to her, held it in her arms, and held it tightly. The panda doll was very soft, but had no warmth. Li Xiaolu was even more greedy for the feeling of being in Chen Tao's arms. Li Xiaolu closed her eyes and couldn't help but start thinking wildly. She thought of Chen Tao, and thought of replacing Pai in the picture with herself, and Li Xiaolu blushed even more. An hour later, after Chen Tao comforted Pai, he returned to base number 1 and Li Xiaolu's room. Came to Li Xiaolu's bedroom. As soon as he arrived in the bedroom, Chen Tao smelled a faint fragrance, very light. It was the unique fragrance of a girl. Chen Tao's eyes fell on the bed. On the bed, Li Xiaolu was hiding under the quilt, revealing her delicate little face and long ink-like hair, looking so beautiful. She closed her eyes and seemed to have fallen asleep, but her face was flushed and the corners of her mouth were slightly raised. She didn't know what sweet dream she was having. Chen Tao also got into bed and lay next to Li Xiaolu. He looked at Li Xiaolu in front of him. Li Xiaolu was wearing a very thin pink lace nightgown. That touch of pink looked even more beautiful when paired with her skin that was half as thick as gel. Lying on the bed, you can see her slender collarbone and round and slender jade shoulders up close. Her long, ink-like hair was naturally draped behind her back, revealing her delicate face. She has long and narrow eyelashes, a high bridge of nose and thin lips. She is very cute and charming. Li Xiaolu's cheeks were slightly red. She didn't know what she was dreaming about, and the corners of her mouth were slightly raised. "Tao, don't be like this," Li Xiaolu murmured softly, talking in her sleep. Li Xiaolu blushed. "Okay, Tao, you are good or bad?" Her voice seemed to be floating from the clouds. It was very soft. If Chen Tao hadn't had good ears, he might not have been able to hear her clearly. Her sleep talk immediately made Chen Tao make a judgment. Chen Tao smiled. It seemed that she was not only dreaming, but this dream was also an exciting dream. Is that how she thinks about herself? You actually even dream about yourself? Chen Tao raised his hand, took Li Xiaolu's hand in front of him, and pulled it down to avoid blocking him. After finishing it, Chen Tao approached Li Xiaolu's face, his eyes fell on her thin lips, and he leaned closer. A kiss. Parted lips. Chen Tao could see Li Xiaolu's eyelashes moving, and then slowly opened her eyes. Look at Chen Tao. Eyes facing each other. Li Xiaolu was startled for a moment, and 2 wisps of red clouds flew over her face. She had just woken up, with a look of confusion on her face. Tao. Chen Tao smiled, put his arm around her waist, looked at her and said with a smile, "Do you miss me so much? Can you dream of me in your dreams?" Li Xiaolu was startled and realized that this was not a dream. She blushed and slowly hid her face in Chen Tao's arms. I didn't dream about you." Chen Tao laughed and said, "Really? But when you were talking in your sleep just now, you could have said, 'Chen Tao, you are so bad, Chen Tao, don't be like this.'" Ugh. When Li Xiaolu heard this, she turned red with embarrassment. She hit Chen Tao's chest with her small hands and said, "Don't say it, it's so embarrassing." Chen Tao smiled, leaned close to Li Xiaolu's ear, and said, "Dreaming is so boring, how about we turn this dream into reality? You are so bad. You are a bad guy in the dream, but you are still a big bad guy in reality." Li Xiaolu blushed like a cloud. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 378. Chen Tao spent 2 hours comforting Li Xiaolu. In fact, it has only been a few days since Chen Tao left base number 1, and it has only been a few days since he and Li Xiaolu separated. However, Chen Tao had just confirmed their relationship with Li Xiaolu. For Li Xiaolu, she and Chen Tao were in love. Of course, a girl in love cannot bear to be separated from her beloved man. A little farewell is better than a newlywed. It's quite interesting to meet again. 2 hours later. Chen Tao looked at Li Xiaolu beside him. Li Xiaolu was lying on her side with a pillow on her head. She looked at Chen Tao with her big eyes. She smiled and said, "I've seen it all." "See it?" Chen Tao blinked. When did Li Xiaolu become so bold? After watching Chen Tao's live broadcast, she actually dared to speak out directly. Chen Tao smiled and said, "You said it before I even asked you about peeking into my private life. When did my little beauty become so bold?" Li Xiaolu was startled, her face turned red, she hit Chen Tao's chest with her little hand, and said, "Nonsense, I didn't say that. I mean, I saw you being active in that civilization. I see you changing and liberating the sanctuary." She raised her face, looked at Chen Tao, her eyes glowing with luster, and said with a smile, "You have wings, you look so handsome in the night sky." Hearing this, Chen Tao looked at Li Xiaolu and smiled, "Are you handsome?" Yeah, Li Xiaolu nodded and said, "Very handsome. In fact, when I saw that civilization through the mirror, I also felt that the rules of that civilization were very strange. I also wanted to change it, but I didn't know what to do." Li Xiaolu looked at Chen Tao and said, "In the end, you did just that. It feels like you arrived at that civilization, just like the protagonist, and changed that civilization easily." Main character? Chen Tao's eyebrows slightly stretched, and he said with a smile, "Actually, you can easily change them, as long as you are a little more domineering. If we have evolved our genes to this extent, in that world, to them, we will be like gods." Li Xiaolu's eyes glowed with luster. She pursed her thin lips and said, "Well, maybe, if it were me, I definitely can't do it." Chen Tao smiled, his hand fell on Li Xiaolu's back, and he gently held her in his arms. He stroked her back with his hand, soothing her little emotions. He said softly, "It doesn't matter, you have me, just fine." Li Xiaolu's eyelashes trembled slightly and she slowly closed her eyes. "Well." Seeing Li Xiaolu's well-behaved appearance, Chen Tao smiled. Chen Tao accompanied Li Xiaolu tenderly, enjoying the tenderness that had lasted a few days. It didn't take long. "That's right," Li Xiaolu suddenly said softly. Hearing Li Xiaolu's voice, Chen Tao lowered his head and looked at Li Xiaolu. Li Xiaolu looked at Chen Tao and said, "Betty came to my place before, and she also saw what happened between you and Pei Ai through the mirror. She seemed a little unhappy." Upon hearing this, Chen Tao blinked and touched the back of his head. Li Xiaolu pursed her thin lips and said with a smile, but it's no wonder, Betty has your child, but you are still doing bad things outside. She leaned her little head on Chen Tao's chest. I think you have to go find Betty and comfort her, otherwise Betty will get angry and it won't be easy to handle. Chen Tao couldn't help but smile. Well, yes. Li Xiaolu slowly closed her eyes. Go ahead, I'm a little sleepy and want to sleep. She spoke softly, with a hint of laziness and fatigue in her voice. Don't worry, I'll accompany you. Chen Tao gently stroked her silky hair and kissed her hair. Yet her voice was lazy, with just a smile on her lips. Although Li Xiaolu was already very satisfied, if Chen Tao just left her to find Betty, she would be fine, but she was even happier when she heard that Chen Tao was going to stay and felt Chen Tao's tenderness. Chen Tao stayed with her quietly and tenderly. After a while, he heard the beauty in his arms breathing calmed down. Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly and he looked at Li Xiaolu. Li Xiaolu closed her eyes, she fell asleep, sleeping soundly. Seeing this, Chen Tao looked back and got out of bed quietly. Other side. Little Betty was sitting in front of the sofa. She had nothing to do, so she sat in front of the sofa and watched the TV screen. On the table in front of her was a steak. Little Betty was holding a knife and fork, cutting and eating steak while watching the TV screen. At this time, Chen Tao's figure appeared next to little Betty. Chen Tao looked at Betty, who was sitting on the edge of the sofa, eating seriously and watching TV. What a treat! Chen Tao looked at Betty. Betty was wearing a loose shirt that fit her slender figure. She was very petite, sitting on the edge of the sofa, her little feet barely reaching the ground. Although petite, her body proportions are perfect and very cute. Betty's long red hair hangs naturally behind her back, looking very smooth, like a red waterfall. Those slender legs are thin, white, and straight, with delicate and smooth skin. Chen Tao looked at Betty's lovely figure. Chen Tao smiled, why aren't there two ponytails today? Betty was slightly startled, and she turned her face to look at Chen Tao. Seeing Chen Tao, Betty frowned cutely, her cheeks suddenly puffed up, she snorted, and retracted her gaze, not looking at Chen Tao. She took a knife and fork and put a piece of cut beef into her mouth, chewing, her cheeks puffed up, and ignored Chen Tao. The more she thought about it, the angrier Betty got. Betty just found out that she was pregnant a while ago, and it was only a few days later that Chen Tao ran away to have fun outside. This made Betty very angry and unhappy. Seeing Betty's reaction, Chen Tao smiled, walked over, and sat next to Betty. Betty turned her face to the side, facing the back of her head to Chen Tao, without even looking at Chen Tao. Looking at Betty's action, Chen Tao retracted his gaze, looked ahead, and said, actually, the reason I left was because I was afraid that I couldn't help but touch you again. You have a child, and if I keep touching you, it will be bad for the child. So, I chose to go outside. I was afraid that I couldn't help staying here. After all, you are so cute. When Betty heard this, her bulging cheeks slowly subsided, her eyes were shining, and her little hand subconsciously touched her flat belly. It turned out that this man left because of this. Realizing this, Betty felt a warm current flowing into her heart and warming her heart. So that's it? Betty slowly retracted her gaze and looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao looked ahead, his expression somewhat helpless. Looking at Chen Tao's expression, Betty pursed her thin lips. Suddenly, Chen Tao felt a movement next to him. He turned his head and saw Betty holding a fork with beef on it and bringing it to Chen Tao. Betty looked at Chen Tao with her big ruby eyes and said, I wronged you. Come, Betty will feed you as compensation, okay? Listening to Betty's beautiful lowly voice and looking at her innocent ruby eyes, Chen Tao smiled, opened his mouth and took a bite. Watching Betty take back the fork, Chen Tao smiled and said, compared to the steak, I want to taste you more. Betty was startled and her face turned red. Bad guy. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 379. Chen Tao picked up Betty and let the petite Betty sit in his arms. Betty was slightly startled. She raised her face and looked at Chen Tao. Eyes facing each other. Chen Tao smiled, I'm still used to holding you in my arms. Betty's face turned slightly red and she looked away. Ignore you, I haven't finished my steak yet. She took the knife and fork and was cutting the steak. Chen Tao didn't tease her, he stayed with her and finished the steak quietly. Finished the steak. Chen Tao hugged Betty into his arms. Petite Betty is very light as a cloud, and can't feel the slightest weight. Chen Tao hugged Betty and walked to the bed. Betty's face flushed, and she looked at Chen Tao. Don't make trouble, didn't you say that touching me would hurt the child? Hearing this, Chen Tao looked at Betty and smiled, just be gentle. Betty blushed and said, as expected, you should stay outside and not come back. As soon as you come back, you will think of ways to torment me. Although Betty said so, Chen Tao could see that Betty's face was red, and there was a trace of joy in her big eyes. Looking at Betty's expression, it can be seen that Betty only resisted with her mouth, but her delicate lowly face showed a trace of joy, and the corners of her mouth were slightly raised. Although she seemed to hide it consciously, she still couldn't hide it. Chen Tao smiled and stopped talking. Putting Betty's small figure on the bed, Chen Tao looked at Betty. Eyes facing each other. Betty's eyes were shining. She raised her small palm and touched Chen Tao's face. Chen Tao raised his hand and held her little hand. Betty's hands are small. It was very small. Her little hand could only hold at most 3 of Chen Tao's fingers, which was very small. After all, Betty now has a lowly body shape. Chen Tao's big hands gently wrapped her little hands. Her little hands were soft, as if they had no bones, and they were very small. Chen Tao looked at Betty's little face. Under Betty's eyes was a tall nose, and below that was a thin, small mouth. Betty felt like an immature fruit to Chen Tao, very immature, but very delicious. Chen Tao lowered his face. Betty closed her eyes. In fact, Chen Tao lied to Betty. The reason why he ran to the civilization over there was just to have fun and not think too much. The reason why Chen Tao said that to Betty was just to coax Betty. And the effect is remarkable. After all, Betty had never been pregnant, and she had never done any research on that aspect. After hearing what Chen Tao said, she believed it. Of course, if it goes too far, it will indeed have an impact on the children, but Betty and Chen Tao both have special physiques. As long as their children are controlled, problems will not occur easily. An hour later, Betty was like a tamed kitten, nestling in Chen Tao's arms. She had her eyes closed, her hair was messy, but she had a smile on her face. Chen Tao looked at Betty and gently stroked her hair with his hand, comforting her gently. He said, "Are you happy?" Betty blushed and said, "Why are you happy? I'm so unlucky to meet you. If I hadn't met you, I would have conquered the Dragon City and become the king of the universe." Betty raised her face, looked at Chen Tao, and said, "Now I can't be the king, and I'm still being bullied by you like this. I want to give you a baby, huh?" She pursed her thin lips and looked at Chen Tao, her eyes watery, and she seemed aggrieved. But Chen Tao could notice the slightly raised corners of her lips, which didn't look aggrieved at all. Chen Tao smiled and said, "Are you talking about future Betty?" The timeline of future Betty has indeed become the king, but she doesn't seem happy. Future Betty, for Chen Tao, personally destroyed the world she lived in, and even wanted to destroy herself. "She's not me." Betty looked at Chen Tao playfully and said, "She's from another timeline." After all, she's not exactly me. How do you know that I would be unhappy if I became the king of the universe? Woolen cloth. Chen Tao smiled. He approached Betty and said, but I wouldn't be happy if I didn't meet you. I can't keep you close to me. For me, this is too cruel and painful. Are you willing to make your man suffer like this? Betty looked at Chen Tao with her ruby eyes and looked at Chen Tao's disappointed expression. Betty pursed her thin lips, smiled, and said, then there's nothing I can do, since you can't live without me, I'll reluctantly stay by your side. She leaned her head against Chen Tao's chest. Chen Tao smiled, I want to give birth to a child. Betty's face turned red, I didn't want children in the first place, it's all your fault. Chen Tao hugged Betty, gently stroked her hair, and said softly, I can't help it, after all, it's overwhelming. Besides, aren't you willing? Give me a child. Betty's face turned red, I am willing. Chen Tao kissed her forehead and said with a smile, you are so good. Betty snorted softly and said, I am willing, but what I don't want is all your fault. I love you suddenly, Chen Tao said in her ear. Betty's heart trembled, a warmth sank into her heart, and a sweet feeling surged into her heart. The feeling was irresistible to Betty. Chen Tao leaned close to her ear, exhaled, and said again, you are so cute. Betty blushed and murmured, bad guy, you know I can't refuse you, so you coax me like this. I'm telling the truth. Chen Tao's eyes fell on Betty's cute little face. He looked into her eyes, stroked her cheek, and said with a smile, you are really the cutest in the universe. Betty blushed, hummed softly, hid her little face in Chen Tao's arms, and stopped looking at Chen Tao. Chen Tao stroked the back of Betty's hand with his big hand and said, next, just be good, and don't worry when the baby is born. There are so many people here, if you don't know how to take care of it, they will help. Humph. Betty rolled her eyes at Chen Tao and said, my child, I will take care of it myself. Chen Tao smiled and said, that's even better, you are worthy of being my lovely Betty. Betty's eyes were shining, her cheeks puffed up, and she slowly hid her face in Chen Tao's arms, saying, you are not allowed to leave, you have to take care of it too. This is your responsibility, bad guy. Chen Tao said, yeah, okay, I will definitely take care of it. Yeah. Hearing Chen Tao's answer, Betty responded with relief, and a smile appeared on her face, and she closed her eyes. The two snuggled up to each other and rested together. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 380. The next day, Chen Tao woke up from his sleep. As soon as he regained consciousness, he felt the warmth coming from his arms. He slowly opened his eyes and saw Betty nestled in Chen Tao's arms. So beautiful. Betty sleeping is very cute. A golden hair fell messily on the pure white bed, outlining a beautiful pattern. She has a perfect and delicate baby face, with eyelashes, a high bridge of nose and a thin mouth. Down below, Betty is slender and petite, with small arms. But her skin is as white as cream, delicate and smooth, and flawlessly beautiful. This is Betty, the girl who is deeply loved by Chen Tao. Chen Tao's big hand fell on Betty's cheek. Betty has a lowly body shape and a small face. Chen Tao's hands can cover her small cheeks casually. The piece is smooth and delicate, and you can feel her body temperature. Chen Tao gently touched Betty's little face. Betty's eyelashes trembled slightly. She slowly opened her eyes and saw Chen Tao's face. Eyes facing each other. Betty had just woken up, with a lazy look on her face and a blurred look in her eyes. She looked at Chen Tao. She slowly woke up, felt the big hand on her cheek, and felt Chen Tao's body temperature. A smile appeared on Betty's face, she closed her eyes again, lazily snuggled into Chen Tao's arms, and said, I have never thought about things like this before. Chen Tao blinked and said with a smile, How do you say that? Betty said, since I was exiled by Kadi, I have been staying on that desolate planet. What I do every day is thinking about how to upgrade my genes to unseat Kadi. But sometimes, when I am quiet and not doing research, I am alone, eating alone, sleeping alone, and waking up alone every day. That feeling may be what Betty in the future calls loneliness. Aloof, but there is only one person. After spending so many years like this, I sometimes really feel that the person I am is really gone. Betty raised her face, looked at Chen Tao with big eyes, and said, "It wasn't until you appeared that I realized that was not the case." Hearing this, Chen Tao couldn't help but smile. He said, "From now on, you don't have to worry about being alone. You have me, your other sisters, and her." As he spoke, his hand fell on Betty's flat belly. In this lower abdomen, a little life is being gestated. Betty's face turned slightly red, and she slowly hid her little face in Chen Tao's arms. "But you are really bad. How can there be a man like you who bullies others every day?" Chen Tao blinked and smiled, "Really? I don't believe that I can bear it with such a touching treasure like you in front of me. If I can really bear it, either that man is not good at that, or he is a eunuch." When Betty heard this, she raised her face, gave Chen Tao a roll of her eyes, and snorted softly, "Do you think everyone treats you the same? Pervert, lolicon, huh?" Chen Tao smiled and held Betty's small hand. He looked into Betty's eyes and said with a smile, "So, dear, should we do some exercise this morning? Some scientists have said that morning exercise helps the body." Betty's face turned even redder, and she hid her little head in Chen Tao's arms and said, "I don't want it. You are a bad person, okay, don't make trouble, it was like that yesterday, don't say goodbye today, I'm afraid of hurting the child," Betty said softly. Although she seemed reluctant to say this, her cheeks were red and the corners of her mouth were slightly raised. Who doesn't want his beloved man to love and care for her? Chen Tao smiled, "What are you thinking about? I mean, go out for a walk and exercise, I didn't say do that." Betty was stunned for a moment, then she raised her face and looked at Chen Tao. Eyes facing each other. Chen Tao smiled, "What are you thinking about?" When Betty heard this, her face immediately turned red, and she gave Chen Tao a roll of her eyes. "Ah," she cried out in disbelief, and beat Chen Tao's chest with her small pink fist in embarrassment. "You're bad. You're obviously like this all the time and it makes me think wildly. Now you're still embarrassing me." Betty felt confused for a while. Could it be that she was infected by this bad man and became bad? He actually started thinking wildly because of Chen Tao's few words. Chen Tao held the wrist of Betty's coquettish little hand, and then pulled her down. Betty noticed Chen Tao's behavior and raised her face to look at Chen Tao. Chen Tao smiled, let go of her little hand, hugged her waist, then leaned down and kissed her. After a long time, slowly let go. Chen Tao looked at Betty, whose eyes were filled with moisture. Chen Tao said with a smile, "Okay, I apologize, I make amends. This kiss should be regarded as compensation." Betty rolled her eyes at Chen Tao and hid her face in Chen Tao's arms. "What kind of compensation? You obviously took advantage of me, so this can be considered compensation, huh?" However, after such a kiss, Betty felt particularly comfortable, and she felt particularly good. Betty said softly, "In the past, in my opinion, kissing was a disgusting thing. I never thought about it. In my opinion at the time, who dared to have such an idea about me, let alone real kiss, even thinking about it, will be punished by me. And now you do this thing that makes me feel sick, but you do it as you please. You also say that this is compensation for me. You are going too far." Betty's eyes were shining, and she murmured, "It's just, so strange, I don't hate it at all." Hearing this, Chen Tao's heart warmed slightly, and he said, "If you don't hate it, then you like it." Betty blushed and rolled her eyes at Chen Tao. I'm ignoring you, Lolita control, big pervert. She came out of Chen Tao's arms, pulled up the nightgown next to her, wrapped it around her body, then got up and walked to the bathroom. Chen Tao looked at Betty's back. Betty was wearing that thin gauze nightgown, which perfectly fit her charming figure. Although small, her body proportions were not to be underestimated. So beautiful. Betty walked to the bathroom door. She opened the bathroom door, and when she wanted to enter the bathroom, she subconsciously looked back at Chen Tao, her face red. Don't come in. As she said, she entered the bathroom and closed the door. Chen Tao blinked. Chen Tao couldn't help but smile. Is this a hint? Chen Tao didn't think much about it. He looked at the ceiling. In this way, Pai civilization has also changed. It will take some time to change the rules of the Holy Land and let people adapt. Pai and the others will probably be busy during this period. It would not be good if Chen Tao tormented Pai. Chen Tao thought, let's give them a few days off and let them make some contributions to the Holy Land. While thinking, Chen Tao got out of bed. He walked to the bathroom, opened the bathroom door, went into the bathroom on his own, and closed the door casually.